Thank you so much, Jess and Megan, for understanding the assignment. Good morning, good UUs and others. My name is Mary Shelden, she, her, and I'm here to share with you this morning about an important archetype and what is for me a source of both deeper self-understanding and spiritual fortitude. I'm here to speak with you this morning of my soft spot and indeed my enduring love for spunky girl heroines. For those not steeped in literature or psychology, an archetype is an enduring symbol or motif in literature, art, or mythology that over time becomes embedded in a culture's psyche. My take is that the spunky girl heroine is not just an archetype, but a feminist or womanist archetype. I think we really must need her. I can tell because she has been written over the course of centuries by authors of all genders. Part of how you know whether or not you're looking at a spunky girl heroine is that she disrupts the patriarchal hero narrative by being fiercely, determinedly at the center of her own story, the protagonist. I think we humans need her precisely because she is disruptive. Now, I think it's important to spell out here, this is not how I saw myself growing up. Consciously modeling myself on my father, I was peaceable, affable, manageable, passive. I curled myself around other people's stories, seeing myself in the supportive role. But my mother was a first grade teacher who read to me every night when I was little and encouraged my reading and carefully pointed me in the direction of books with girl protagonists. I loved the stories with boy protagonists too, and I crossed the gender line easily to identify with them, an important skill I still possess. But my mother, who before meeting my father left her abusive first husband with my older sister and brother in tow, she was keen to have me learn stories about girls who dared, who had adventures, who weren't all sugar and spice. She wanted me to understand agency and desire and grit in girls as normal and healthy. And she wanted to build up some resistance to a culture that she knew from experience would tell me otherwise. She wanted to make sure that should it ever be my turn to choose to leave a man who didn't have my best interests at heart, I'd feel able to go, as she had, and in a million other ways to learn to be fiercely, authentically at the center of my own story. Two admirable qualities my mother had in abundance were that she was authentic and that she was fierce. So Jo March of Little Women, Anne Shirley of Green Gables, Dorothy Gale from The Wizard of Oz, Fern Avery of Charlotte's Web, Laura Ingalls, Scout Finch, Pippi Longstocking, Ramona Quimby, these and many other spunky girls were the steadfast companions of my childhood world, and I've read their stories again and again. Important to note, some spunky heroines took longer to get to me. Celie of The Color Purple came to me in high school. In college, I met Janie Crawford of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and Esperanza Cordera of The House on Mango Street, and Taylor Greer of The Bean Trees. Sue Lapice and Iola Leroy reached me in grad school. Allison of Fun Home came to me as a young professor. So many real-life spunky authors have been denied the pen and the page in so many different ways. Denied an education or publication, or banned from the library, or barred from our classrooms, or simply, tragically, unencouraged and undiscovered. From where we sit here now in Black History Month in 2025, it's important we understand and acknowledge this. Still, many of their heroines were written down and survived and made their way to me as the Indigo Girls say of Virginia Woolf, like a message in a bottle. In The Most Magnificent Thing, our story today by Ashley Spires, our girl protagonist reminds me in some ways of my mother. Now, my mom was no engineer. She was an educator, and the teaching of reading was truly her special gift. She taught hundreds of young people to read. As a first grade teacher, then, after she got her master's, as a special educator. My gentle giant of a father was the scientist, a metallurgist who worked for Abbott. We'll come back to him later. But my mother was, like our girl protagonist in the story, an experimenter. As a teacher and as a parent especially, she loved to try new things. And as with our protagonist, if things didn't go her way, my mother might show her temper, which could be explosive and frightening. But then it would blow over, and she'd move past the point of frustration back into learning and reworking. She was a woman of many epiphanies, her own and those she drew out of the people around her. I don't think of myself as naturally at the core of me like my mother or like the girl protagonist in The Most Magnificent Thing. I grew up trying to stay small and hide out. I often stuck to the safe and the known in order to avoid the risk of censure. And I did for a time in my life, especially as an adult, tend toward perfectionism. As social science researcher Brene Brown has explained, perfectionism is a 20-pound shield. It may protect us from criticism as intended, but it also hides us, and it's exhausting to carry around all the time. When perfectionism is the driver, says Brown, shame is riding shotgun, and fear is the annoying backseat driver, especially fear of what people might think. It's hard to live an authentic life, experimenting, trying new things, and sometimes failing, maybe even falling flat on your face when you are anxious about what other people might think of you. This is a lesson that, in many ways, I've taken a lifetime to learn. My teachers helped me learn it, though. One arena where I showed spunk was in the classroom, confident in my good brain and good words. My students helped me to learn it too later. I started teaching composition to college students 30 plus years ago. A graduate student myself, I learned pretty quickly that for all of us, the chief barrier to paper submissions on time was perfectionism, or more precisely, what my therapist referred to as the 3 deadly Ps: perfectionism, procrastination, and panic. These bugaboos do not make for an authentic life or a timely essay. It is really as a teacher that I learned to live a little more like my mother and like the girl in the story, risking failure as I experimented. And this, I think, is one thing the world needs of me, of us. Folks in my circle do not need another automaton gliding through the same old safe channels. They need to see real people engaged in authentic problem solving and map making. There is a significant gap between perfectionism and what Brene Brown calls healthy striving. If we would achieve excellence, we need to learn to risk failure. The protagonist in our story is clearly unafraid of failure. Her early models, attempted and abandoned one by one, are failures that are apparently to her just part of the process. She is also no automaton. Clearly, she has access to her own authentic emotion, including her anger, an emotion so frequently denied utterly to girls and women, as if we could disappear it by censure. If she has her bad moment, she also has a good friend in her furry assistant, sturdy enough to bear witness and help her through it. She is not seeking anyone's approval but her own. Only she will know when she has achieved her goal. This isn't up to anybody else to determine, and it isn't up for debate. Other people in the story find that they like her cast-off work. But it isn't up to them to decide when her project is done. She will know, as she does in the end, when the project has achieved magnificence. I love the way the book is written, that the protagonist, assistant, and project are all unnamed, so that we only know the particulars of them through the illustration. Our central character is every child, but especially every girl, as she is meant to represent and encourage qualities denied to all children in our patriarchal, white supremacist, perfectionist culture, but especially denied to girls and women who are especially expected to look perfect to others. Importantly, if you cannot bear the uncertainties of experimentation, it's awfully hard to be a scientist. In order to achieve excellence through creative, authentic striving, we must be willing to bear the possibility, nay, the likelihood, near certainty of failure. This story, The Most Magnificent Thing, came back to me recently as I was reading another book by real-life spunky girl heroine Abby Wambach. Perhaps you've heard of Wambach. She is retired from soccer, a decorated champion and co-captain of the United States national women's soccer team. Since retirement, she has become a worldwide public figure as a speaker, author, and co-host of a podcast followed by millions, We Can Do Hard Things. The book of Wambach's that I've been reading and rereading, and that you heard Mary Lee read from earlier, is titled Wolfpack: How to Come Together, Unleash Our Power, and Change the Game. The book is brief and really takes the form of a checklist. In this way, it reminds me of another book I've been reading lately, Tim Snyder's On Tyranny, which I also recommend for you use in these times. Wambach's Wolfpack is just 8 brief chapters, each of which articulates a single principle for readers wishing to emulate her spunkiness and embrace it for themselves. 1, you were always the wolf. 2, be grateful and ambitious. 3, lead from the bench. 4, make failure your fuel. 5, champion each other. 6, demand the ball. 7, bring it all. And 8, find your pack. I made it through the audiobook for the first time over the course of a single morning of dusting my house. That should give you a sense of how accessible it is, or perhaps how dusty my house might be. Though my intention today is to lure you toward reading this book and trying on its principles, I have to take just a quick moment to offer one quibble with Wambach's first chapter, You Were Always the Wolf. Whereas Wambach here talks about how girls are often disempowered by being treated like Little Redcap, admonished to stay on the path, stay away from smelling flowers, taught to fear the wolf. My take is that in many versions of the story, including Sondheim's Into the Woods, she earns her place as one of our spunky girl heroines by vanquishing the wolf and wearing its fur, a way to mark that she has embraced some of its qualities as her own. While Wambach here wishes aloud that she could empower her younger self by admonishing young Abby that she was never Red Riding Hood, that she was always the wolf, an empowering message to be sure, I actually think it's possible to be both. That for many of us, it is precisely in straying from the path that we learn that we are both spunky girl heroine and wolf. But setting all of that aside, Wambach here leads us, as she does every chapter, with an old rule for women, followed by a new contrasting rule. In this case, old rule, stay on the path. New rule, make your own path. A couple more that I think matter a good deal for this time in which we find ourselves. I myself feel especially called by chapter 4, make failure your fuel. Wambach describes an experience of playing on the youth national team and getting to visit the locker room of the U.S. women's national team, where she remembers seeing a 5x7 photo taped above the door exiting to the training field. a picture of their longtime rival, the Norwegian national team, celebrating after their victory over the U.S. team in the 1995 World Cup. Years later, when she asked her now national teammates about the photo, they explained that while they seek to win, when failure does come, they don't accept it as evidence that they aren't worthy of playing at the highest level, because they know the lessons from the last loss become the fuel for their next win. Indeed, after the photo went up in the locker room, the next year, the team brought home their first Olympic gold. Wambach's take on women and failure is that women often view failure as proof that we were always unworthy imposters, in large part because the culture insists that we must be perfect before we're worthy even of showing up. Moreover, her take on men strikes a chord just now. She says, imperfect men have been empowered to run the world since the beginning of time, so clearly perfection is not a prerequisite for leadership. Says Wambach, it's time for imperfect women to give themselves permission to lead. And I would suggest, time for the rest of us to give us permission too. Old rule, failure means you're out of the game. New rule, failure means you're finally in the game. Then in chapter 8, Wambach tells about how after celebrating retirement and a brief break, she took up running again, expecting it to go easily for her as it always had. Instead, day after day, it was a painful slog. When she talked it over with her wife, Glennon said, "Babe, you've always had your pack before. Now you're a lone wolf." I noticed that though our spunky girl heroine in The Most Magnificent Thing has a trusted assistant cheering her on, she is largely working on her own. This gives her freedom, of course. At least she isn't inundated with unwanted advice or pressure to conform, what doesn't lead to her most magnificent thing. But also, our feet are heavier without our pack to cheer us. And what we create will lack what they might have contributed. So this morning I'm here to admonish all of us to find our pack. It seems like Beverly UU is a pretty great place to do this, whether it's justice demonstrations or environmental activism or peace advocacy or prison ministry or 12-stepping or spiritual practices, you've got it going on here. Or wherever you look, find your wolf pack. Don't be a lone wolf out there just now. Old rule, you're on your own. New rule, you're not alone. You've got your pack. Finally, for the men in the room today, thank you for being here. I mean, thank you to everyone, of course. This is my very first time preaching anywhere as a guest, and you've made me feel very welcome. Heartfelt thanks to Mary Lee, who's been such a pleasure to work with. But for the men in the room especially, I'm glad you're here listening. And I want to bring us back for a moment to my peaceable, affable father. My dad was, doubtless, like many of you, a sensitive UU guy. For most of his life, he managed to play the corporate game in a suit and tie, but he never let that stop him from accessing what he would have called his feminine side. And he'd have been the first to tell you, truly, he actually led seminars for men about this, what the cost of traditional masculinity was to men as well as to women, in terms of creativity, self-expression, and just outright aliveness. I saw this idea illustrated in reverse at one of the workshops I led in my early adulthood about creativity and the inner child. A male participant, over the course of our days together, discovered he had a spunky girl heroine inside him, and it freed him. From that moment on, his creativity swung wide open. He became a painter, a writer, a ceramicist. I won't try to say how it is for you, but for all of us, every one of us, maybe we could afford to be a little less binary in our gender and see where it might take us. maybe, just maybe, there is a spunky girl heroine within us all, whom we could all embrace and empower. And maybe then we could empower one another's too. To return to our storybook this morning, the most magnificent thing is, as it turns out, a dog-sized scooter sidecar. Something I would never have dreamt up in my girlhood. I love our girl heroine for her spunk, of course. I also love her authenticity, her vulnerability, her willingness to fail, her determination to persist. These are qualities that, thanks to my mother and her spunky girl heroines, through patience and determination, I have developed in myself over time. Really, what I want for us all is to help our spunky girl heroine in the storybook, in our own hearts, and everywhere, to find her wolf pack, especially within our UU congregations. May we learn to disrupt the patriarchal narratives, be real with one another, embrace one another's gifts and vulnerabilities, and strive authentically in an environment safe for learning and failure toward excellence, equity, and justice in our congregations, our communities, and our world. May it be so. May we work together to make it so.
Please rise for the final hymn, which I think is also new to most of us.